The guards burst into the princess's chamber before dawn, when the night watch had not yet been replaced by the day watch in the corridors. The doctor stood by the bed with a basket of polished dishes and sealed vials. On the table lay a cloth bag of herbs, and a lamp smoldered nearby. The senior guard, receiving a signal from the palace steward, pointed to the girl and ordered her hands to be bound. The princess tried to shield her with her body, but she was pushed aside without anyone looking up. The healer did not resist. She only pressed the bag to her chest with her elbows, as if it contained something that must not be dropped. They removed the bandage from her hair, checked the sleeves of her dress, counted the vials, and placed them in a wooden box as evidence of a secret craft. When the girl was taken away, the princess remained barefoot on the cold stone and stared for a long time at the darkening oil stain by the lamp. The servants did not dare to approach because a rumor had already spread throughout the palace. The doctor visited the chambers at night, not only out of concern for health. Until that morning, everything had been kept quiet. Since childhood, the princess had lived at court amid a set of rules: when to get up, how to hold her back, how to place her hands on the table, where to look during audiences. Since she turned 14, her life had been filled with marriage negotiations, lessons in decorum, and rare trips out of town, where she sat in a carriage without touching the curtain. No one spoke aloud about her illness. It manifested itself in pain that came on the eve of holidays and important receptions, hindering her movements, making her gait uneven, and forcing her to hold on to the table to keep her balance. Her mother advised her to be patient and pray. The senior ladies-in-waiting brought herbs wrapped in scarves and brewed something, but the pain returned. A doctor was brought in once after an autumn rain, when the princess was unable to come out for dinner. The girl came from the city bathhouse, where she helped midwives and old women with sore joints. She was found through the palace apothecary, who was tired of being reproached for useless powders and decided to take a chance. The healer was younger than the court doctors, but she moved confidently. She checked the princess's breathing, felt the muscles on her back, and examined her fingers. She made no promises, just worked calmly and for a long time. When the pain subsided, the princess fell asleep for the first time without any distractions, without heaviness in her head, without the usual fear of waking up broken. The next morning she asked for the girl to be called again. Thus began nightly visits, at first rare, then regular, almost daily and hourly. They quickly established a routine. The gatekeeper at the service entrance received a coin and asked no questions. The old nurse aired the room, prepared hot water, and kept a handkerchief by the door in case of tears. The doctor came with a bag containing glass vials of clove tincture, soft bandages, and needles sharpened, as well as a tailor's. She massaged muscles, applied cupping glasses, applied warm bags of salt, taught the princess to breathe evenly and deeply, to watch how her chest rose and fell, not to fall on the pillow with all her weight, but to stretch her head toward the headboard. The pain subsided, and with it went the stiffness. The princess learned to sit at the table without her fingers trembling, to walk around the hall unhurriedly, without biting her lip. After a few weeks, no one had any doubts. The new assistant was useful. The court physician was dissatisfied, but he remained silent at the meeting with the steward. He was afraid of losing his position and pretended that he had arranged everything himself. The king learned about the changes belatedly and did not consider it necessary to intervene. He was busy with negotiations on grain supplies, letters from neighboring lands, and letters from cities where merchants complained about customs duties. At receptions, the princess stood next to her mother, never dropping her fan. Several times, the king even nodded to her from afar, as if she were an adult. And everything could have continued just as smoothly if it weren't for the habits of the court. In the narrow passages between the offices stood people who liked to spread rumors. Servants with dishes peeked into the ladies-in-waiting's chambers, wanting to know why the young doctor was staying in her bedroom longer than usual. The palace chaplain caught himself thinking that he saw the girl too often in the evening hours. He liked to talk about order to his flock. For him, order meant clear boundaries and no strange exceptions. Once he approached the steward and uttered a short phrase about night visits. The steward, a cautious man, did not write down this phrase, but passed it on as advice to check if everything was in order. The check was carried out carefully. First, the gatekeeper was replaced. Then the maid who kept the corridor was replaced. Finally, 2 guards in plain clothes were sent to the doctor and instructed to watch from the gate to the room. That night, the princess could not relax her shoulders for a long time. The doctor asked for hot water, applied a bag of salt to her neck, and gave her a spoonful of tincture. When the pain subsided, they were both tired. The doctor extinguished the lamp, leaving a small flame in the corner, and began to gather her instruments. At that moment the door flew open, and the steward's men entered the room. The arrest went quickly. The box with the vials was sealed with wax and taken to the office. The doctor was taken to the lower building, where servants were held before interrogation. The princess was left alone. She did not cry because she saw no point in tears that no one would notice. She knew that in the morning, the need for explanations would become a common cause. The nanny wanted to raise a fuss, but the princess told her to sit quietly. The room remained as silent as it had been in her childhood, which frightened her the most. Within this silence, she understood clearly for the first time that no one in this house belonged to her, not even her own breath. At dawn, the princess went to the audience hall. The king received visitors early, when it was easier to think and decide on letters. She approached unaccompanied, without looking around. The servants tried not to meet her gaze. None of them dared to stop her. The king was surprised to see his daughter so early. He was not expecting her, and already had a list of tasks for the day in his hand. She stood opposite him and bowed her head. She did not need words. Even without words, it was clear what she wanted. The king did not like long scenes. He nodded and said what he usually said in questionable cases. There will be an investigation. Everything will be done according to the law. No one will be harmed. He said this in the standard voice he used to sign decrees. The princess nodded and left just as quietly. Then everything went on as usual, and this course rarely changes the usual route. The chancellery sealed the apothecary's notes. The chaplain wrote a brief note about the moral risk of night visits. The court physician brought a certificate listing the rules of treatment allowed within the palace walls, and noted that unauthorized practitioners without a license were not allowed to enter the bedrooms. The guard who had escorted the doctor from the gate indicated in his report that the girl had arrived at night and would have left before cock-crow if she had not been detained. There was no malice in these reports, only cold logic. The papers were filed away, the case was taken to the secretary, and the secretary explained the essence of the matter to the king. The king nodded again, because that is how power works. They bring him hard facts and offer him a firm decision. That same evening, the palace executioner came down to the lower building. He lived outside the walls, but came inside for important matters. This was not an important matter, but it was a significant one. He was ordered not to kill, but to punish. The punishment was called edification. Its purpose was to make everyone understand the limits of what was permissible. The healer was brought into a room with a stone table. Her ribbons were removed, her nails were trimmed, and her teeth were checked. She was given water because without water, the tongue becomes numb too quickly, and here it was necessary for her to hold on until the end. The night was empty, but that didn't matter. The next morning, a short service was held in the palace chapel. Immediately after that, the servants gathered in the lower courtyard, having been ordered to come without further ado. The girl was brought out into the middle. Her hair was tied at the back of her head so that it would not get in the way. The executioner worked efficiently. He cut off her tongue quickly, without a second attempt. Then he took smaller instruments and set about her nails. It all happened within a few minutes. The executioner carried away a basket with cloths and instruments. The girl was taken back. The steward reported to the king that the punishment had been carried out. He added that she had been punished not for love, but for violating the rules of entry and treatment. But no one understood the meaning of this addition. Rumors still spread about the main event. They spread throughout the kitchen, the laundry room, and the stables. Everywhere, people talked about the same detail. The day before, the king had promised mercy, but in the morning, the punishment had taken place. The truth was that the king had not promised anything specific. He had uttered the usual formula, but on days like these, formulas sound like promises, even if they have no firm content. The princess knew this, but she was not prepared for the speed with which everything happened. She closed the door and did not open it to anyone except her nurse. Sometimes food was brought in through the side door. Sometimes letters were brought from distant relatives who understood nothing and asked for at least a line. The princess did not respond. The first week, she tried to read. Books lay on the table, but the letters blurred. Then she tried to restore her previous routine: gymnastics, breathing, neck stretching, light meals without hot spices, rub-downs, but her body did not obey. The pain came suddenly and robbed her of her strength. She remembered the doctor's hands and the movement that brought relief. She tried to repeat it herself. It didn't work well. The nurse helped as best she could, but she was no match for the doctor. And the princess did what she had not dared to do before. She ordered the doctor's bag, which had been left by the bed in the commotion of the arrest, to be brought to her. In the bag were 2 needles, a thin bandage, and a wooden stick with chalk marks on the palm. Tiny spots of tincture remained on the thin fabric. The princess sorted through these things as one sorts through the letters of the deceased, searching not for words, but for breath. A month passed. The king asked the steward a couple of times if his daughter would recover. He was told that she needed rest. He did not insist. Life outside continued as before. People in the city continued to argue about the price of bread. The younger children of the courtiers were married in the basilica. The chancellor argued with the treasurer. Only in one room did nothing change. There, the window remained closed day and night. There was a table with a stone lamp and a bag of medicine that no one dared to throw away. When her mother tried to visit, the door remained locked. Through her nurse, the princess said she was tired and wanted silence. The nurse asked her to eat some soup because she would not be able to survive without strength. The princess nodded and sat down again on the floor by the bed. She watched how the color of her skin changed on her fingers when she clenched and unclenched her fist, because that was the only thing she could observe that did not require anyone else's decisions. 6 months later, short notes appeared in the palace archives. The princess does not leave her room. The chaplain came twice, but was not received. The court physician suggested sending another assistant. The steward refused because he did not want a repeat. The servants began to forget what the princess's voice sounded like. They spoke of her as a pale shadow that left her bed only to go to the wardrobe and return. The king signed papers and waited for everything to settle down on its own. His life was scheduled, and he did not know how to break schedules. Sometimes he remembered how well his daughter had behaved at the reception and wondered how quickly everything had changed. But he pushed these thoughts away because he didn't know what to do with them. Meanwhile, the doctor lay in the lower wing, where those who could not be released and were not wanted in plain sight were kept. She was brought soup and water. She had nothing to say, which made it easier to supervise her. An old woman who had once washed clothes in the river and knew how to care for the wounded sat with her. She helped her drink, wiped her lips, and changed her bandages. The girl began to write in gestures, but no one understood her language. Her hands were quick, but now her fingers ached, and her signs were uneven. She was given a board and chalk, but only crooked lines appeared on the board. Time stood still in the lower wing. When a year had passed, the courtiers stopped waiting for the princess to return to the hall. The servants got used to working without her glances and nods. The nurse learned to accept silence as a constant form of presence. Sometimes she would sit by the door and talk aloud about palace news, even though she knew no one inside was listening. She also brought news from the city. There, they said that a girl who had lost her voice would not be kept for long. Some added that such girls were sent back to their families. Others argued that they were given to monasteries to serve as maids. However, the nurse was not let go. She remained downstairs for another year. People stopped noticing her. The third year began just like the previous ones. The princess woke up early and did not get out of bed. When the pain subsided, she would sit on the floor and sort through bandages. Sometimes she would ask her nurse to lay out needles and a wooden stick on the table and try to remember the sequence of touches with which the doctor relieved her spasms. She no longer believed in recovery. She clung to the order of movements because this order connected her to the past. At the end of winter, she wrote a short note to the steward. The note contained a request to take her to a monastery on the outskirts, beyond the northern gates. The steward habitually reached for a template for replies, but then realized that there was no template for such a case. He went to the king. The king was silent for a long time because the choice was strange. Widows, or those who had no place in marriage contracts, went to the monastery. The princess was not a widow. Perhaps something could have worked out with marriage if she had returned to the hall and talked to the inner fortress. However, she did not talk and did not return. The king did not like it when someone broke the rules, but it seemed even more difficult to prevent her from leaving. He signed the order. The administrator made a list of things that the princess would need for the journey and in her cell. The nurse packed a trunk. The journey took half a day. The princess sat in a closed carriage, not pulling back the curtain. At the monastery gate, she was met by the abbess. She saw a pale girl with her hands on her knees, not looking around. The abbess knew that many came here, not out of desire, but because they had no other choice. She showed her to her cell, a narrow bed, a table, a barrel of water, a hook for clothes, and a basket of thread. In the evening they brought bread and water, paper and a slate. The princess thanked them with a glance and remained alone. She put the healer's bag in a box, and for the first time in many months fell asleep without fear of the morning footsteps outside the door. Life in the monastery was simple but not empty. Morning prayers, communal meals, work in the garden, long hours of sewing, reading the Psalter, and short conversations with the abbess. The princess did not speak at general meetings. Her silence was accepted without question. Here they did not like unnecessary words. The abbess noticed that the girl often sat clenching and unclenching her fists, and offered her a job in the sewing room, where patience was required. There she quickly found her rhythm, unwinding spools, cutting fabric into even strips, keeping an eye on the tension of the thread. The pain subsided when her hands were busy. The sisters were amazed at her diligence. At evening service, she stood aside and did not raise her head. Sometimes the sick were brought to the monastery. The sisters washed their wounds, rubbed their joints, and changed their bandages. The princess stood nearby and handed them bandages. When it was necessary to apply pressure to a vessel, she did so firmly and carefully. The sisters taught her how to wash herbs, boil ointments, and dry medicinal leaves. She worked silently but clearly. One evening, a woman from the city was brought to the monastery. Her hands were inflamed, and she could not straighten her fingers. The abbess told the princess to hold her elbow and showed her where to warm the salt. The movement was familiar. The princess remembered how the doctor had started with these very places. She repeated the sequence, and for the first time in several days, the woman was able to bend her palm. After this incident, the abbess instructed the princess to help in the treatment room more often. Rumors reached the monastery late, through letters brought by a merchant. People in the city said that the princess was silent, not uttering a sound. The abbess confirmed this to the merchant and told him not to ask any questions. She accepted the princess's silence as a vow, even if it was unspoken. The monastery did not require everyone to make the same promises. Here, they respected what a person chose for themselves, as long as it did not harm the common cause. The princess began to get up before the bell rang and come to the infirmary before dawn. She heated the water, ground the herbs, and laid out the instruments in their places. Sometimes she held a thin needle in her palm and tried to remember how the healer had placed it on the surface of the skin to relieve the spasm. She did this carefully, and several times she succeeded. Once, an unsigned letter arrived at the monastery. The letter said that a girl who had once been brought from the inner chambers at night had died in the lower wing of the palace. She died quietly, without causing a stir. She was buried in the city cemetery. No one from the palace came. The merchant who brought the letter shrugged and left. The abbess read the letter and put it on the table. She knew that showing it to the princess would be like putting a stone in the pocket of a man who was already walking on water. But she did not like secrets. In the evening, she went into the cell, put the letter on the table, and left. The princess returned from work and saw the thin sheet of paper. She read a few lines, sat down on the edge of the bed, and held her hands still for a long time. Late at night, she took out the healer's bag, laid out the needles and stick on the table, and placed the letter next to them. In the morning, she got up to pray, as usual. Over time, her silence became part of the monastery's discipline. The sisters knew that she did not respond with words, but she heard and understood. She was entrusted with the most monotonous tasks, where the results only appeared after months: drying herbs in the right shade, sorting seeds, mending cloth, and copying accounts for the vegetable garden. She was tired, but she found comfort in the predictability. The pain receded when she did not force herself to think about the past. On rare evenings, when the nurse came from the palace and brought bread and scarves, the princess sat next to her in the garden. The nurse told her about those who had married, those who had left, those who pretended that nothing had happened. The princess listened and nodded. She did not say a word. The nurse realized that this would be the case until the end. Over the years, the princess became a master of quiet deeds. She was sent to the city for varnish for the tables. She wore a cloak so that no one would recognize her. No one did. To the city, she was just an ordinary woman from the monastery, carrying a bundle of cloth. In the shop, she saw some apothecary bottles, and without thinking chose the one that the doctor had once brought. She paid, returned, and placed the bottle on the third shelf of the medicine cabinet, where it could be easily reached when quick relief was needed. The abbess saw this movement and said nothing. She understood that everyone has memories that cannot be taken away and cannot be alleviated by the words of others. Years passed. The king grew old and began to visit his hunting lodges less often. The princess was only mentioned at council meetings when the subject of succession came up. Then someone would timidly say that the daughter was alive, but had gone to a convent and did not wish to return. That was the end of the conversation. Her mother sometimes asked her confessor to take letters to the convent. The princess received the letters but did not reply. She did not even write to the abbess, although she had suggested more than once that she should put everything down on paper and then burn it if it made her feel better. The princess refused. She guarded her silence as one would hold a vessel without handles, so as not to drop it. New sisters came to the monastery. They heard the old story, but took it as a legend whose authors were no longer around. To them, the princess was a silent sister who did everything on time and never argued. They saw how she knew how to hold someone's hand when it hurt, and how she placed the needle on the skin so that no mark would remain. They thought she was born that way. No one remembered how she stood in the hall with her back straight, waiting for the king's nod. One year, when winter dragged on, the princess fell ill. The illness came quickly, without warning. At first, she stopped getting up for morning prayers. Then it became difficult for her to hold a spoon. The abbess placed 2 young sisters by her bed. They changed her water, brought her warm milk, and rubbed her temples. The nurse arrived and stayed for a week. The princess lay quietly, making no unnecessary movements. On the 3rd day, she gestured for someone to bring her a bag. The sisters placed it next to her. She ran her fingers over the fabric, took out a wooden stick, and placed it on her chest. Then she closed her eyes and fell asleep. In the morning, the abbess realized that her breathing was even but weaker than in the evening. She sent for the priest and dismissed the sisters to attend to their duties. The nurse sat silently. By evening, the princess began to breathe more deeply, as if she were preparing for her final journey. She did not ask for water or make any gestures. Her face was calm, as it had been when she held someone else's hand in the infirmary. When the bell rang for evening prayers, her breathing stopped. The abbess closed her eyes and covered her with a cloth. The nurse remained alone in the cell, and only then allowed herself to cry quietly. She understood that the princess had chosen this end just as she had once chosen silence, and that this was the only thing within her power. After the funeral, the abbess ordered the cell to be cleared out. In a box, they found an unsigned letter and the healer's bag, neatly tied up. The letter was placed in the monastery archives. The bag was placed on the 3rd shelf of the medicine cabinet, where the bottle that the princess had once brought from the city stood. The sisters talked for a long time about how skillfully she worked with needles and how patiently she held the hand of anyone who was afraid of pain. No one spoke loudly. In this place, loud words were considered unnecessary. The news was received quietly in the palace. The king read the note and stared out the window for a long time, where nothing was happening except the usual movements of the servants. He put the paper aside and called the chancellor to discuss the collection of taxes. The next day, the chaplain quietly commemorated the deceased during the service. No one recalled the details of the past. The servants who knew about the night visits had either grown old or left. The young ones did not understand why people in the kitchen sometimes lowered their eyes when the infirmary was mentioned. A year later, the archivist put the file on the night inspection under other files and forgot about it. In the city, the legend turned into a short parable about a princess who went to a convent and remained silent until her death. People loved simple stories. It seemed important to them that there were no loose ends in this story. Love did not save her. Promises did not work. Punishment was carried out. Silence became her home, and manual labor was the only order that could be maintained when all other orders were broken. No one talked about how exactly the tongue fell on the knife blade and how many blows fell on the nails. They didn't like to remember that. But many knew that sometimes, in the infirmary, by the north wall of the monastery, the lamp would stay lit until late at night, and there would sit a woman in a dark dress who did not ask questions, but simply held her hand in such a way that the pain receded. And so, the story remained, without loud scenes, without evidence or excuses. The girl who knew how to take away other people's pain lost her voice and disappeared under the stone vault of the lower wing. The princess, who could only live with her silent skill, chose her silence as the last thing that remained stable. Power did not change course. The palace clock ticked steadily. The monastery bells called to prayer. Merchants argued about duties, treasurers about accounts. Stories rarely break these mechanisms. They only leave objects in the folds of time that allow us to guess what was truly important. Here, such an object was a bag of needles, a wooden stick with chalk dots, and a quiet order of movements that outlived everyone in this story who made a choice and carried it through to the end.